This video is going to take a look at our unit that we've just discussed on the Native American West from about 1865 to 1900. Now, one of the things we looked at earlier in this unit is how the building of the Transcontinental Railroad united the United States of America, East and West, but that what it really did was it invaded the territory of the Native Plains Indians, especially the Sioux, the Crow, the Nez Perce, etc. And what we see is that the railroad, though it connects the nation with trade and transportation, what it does is it cuts a swath through native lands. So the railroad really interrupts native culture. It interferes with the hunting of the buffalo. It gets so bad that Americans are literally getting on the railroads and they're hunting the buffalo from the railroads. And in an attempt at doing so, killing the buffalo also means killing the Native American cultures. So if you can kill the buffalo, you're killing off what the natives need, the animal that they lived off of on the Plains Indians. So that way you could kill off their culture. The Native Americans relied so heavily on the buffalo, there were approximately 40 million buffalo roaming the plains, roaming the United States before the United States was even created. By 1900, only 500 wild buffalo remained. And there were so many buffalo that were killed that you could see mountains of skulls. And by doing this, what the Americans were doing was they were killing the resource the Native Americans needed. So that was huge. Now, something that's often overlooked in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad are the people that built it. Thousands of freed blacks from the Civil War moved westward to help build the railroad. Thousands of Chinese immigrants moved from China and came to the United States to help build the railroad. We see almost 20,000 Chinese immigrants coming to the United States building the railroad. Some 1,500, because accounts vary, died while building the railroad. What the Chinese brought was an unskilled labor, but handling dynamite and building through the mountains of the Sierras, literally deconstructing the mountains to construct a railroad. And without Chinese labor and immigrant labor and the freed black labor, this Transcontinental Railroad would not have been built. And it was a race between the East and the West. In that very famous image, we see that the building and the uniting of the two railroads, that we don't see any freed blacks. We don't see any Chinese immigrants in the railroad in an attempt to make it look like it was a white America's progress of East and West connecting. Now, with the building of the railroad and the furthering and spreading of Americans westward, we see the creation of reservations. Reservations are land that the government sets aside that the Native Americans are forced to live on. And they're not always necessarily the lands where the natives wanted to live or lived on before. So the natives might have wandered all of South Dakota, but now they're confined to one area of South Dakota. And basically what we see is the chipping away of land by the United States government, forcing the natives to live in these small areas where they're required to go. Now, one of the things, again, not necessarily their homeland. The natives, while moving to the reservations, are going to be forced to give up their ways of life. So no longer may they be nomads. No longer may they follow the animals. And they're having to give up some of that culture. So they're being forced into this land that the government is now telling them they have to live in. We also see the reliance on the government with rations. The government gives the natives ration tickets where they get food, clothing, blankets. Some of these things are things that the natives didn't even need or had before. So what they're actually doing is the government's forcing the natives to live like whites, build permanent homes, farm, send their children to white American schools to learn English and to learn American culture. So that way there is no native culture to be had. It's forced assimilation. In some cases, they might even be converted to Christianity and given white American Christian names. We also see that these government ration tickets, medical supplies, and clothing, some of these things natives didn't have before, and now they're being reliant on from the United States government. Forced assimilation to build homes, dress like whites, send their kids to schools. And also, there might not even be the resources on these reservations. Some of the things they might have run out of. Oh, we don't have your sugar for this month. We don't have the meat for this month. Or the meat from this month was bad. or we were out of blankets. And so it's a way of controlling the Native Americans, in a way of controlling their culture to force them to slowly get to a path towards American citizenship. The most resistant group of natives were the Sioux, led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Both Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull led massive resistance in June of 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in Montana, where all of 200 plus Custer's men were slaughtered and killed and butchered on the fields. Custer wanted to basically tame the West and take the Sioux, and his noontime raid onto a Native American settlement of about 5,000 proved to be fatal, as Custer's men were slaughtered. And this was a tremendous victory for the natives, but it also came as a tremendous defeat. It was a very temporary victory, as the natives, yes, defeated the American forces only 100 years after America was founded, 1776, 1876. But as the natives were victorious in defeating Custer and the United States military, they unfortunately would then see more military come to the West, more Native Americans having to fight against Americans, and more control and fight between the two people. Even though it was victorious, it led to its eventual defeat. Sitting Bull flees to Canada, and in 1881, Sitting Bull and the remaining Lakota Sioux of his tribe from Canada come back to the United States in 1881 after hearing the death of Crazy Horse in 1876. And Sitting Bull and the remaining Sioux, they surrender to the American government, and they're forced to live on the Pine Ridge and Standing Rock reservations in present-day South Dakota. When Sitting Bull surrendered and when Crazy Horse surrendered, it pretty much meant all massive Native American resistance by the Sioux had ended. That the great leader, the great medicine man leader Sitting Bull, the great warriors, Crazy Horse, their surrendering pretty much means it's the end of true resistance. Finally, in 1890, we see the revival of some Native American culture. A prophet named Wovoka, who practiced some American Christian ways, but still practiced tribal ways of the Sioux, created this thing called the ghost dance. The Sioux would wear these buffalo hide shirts, and they would be called ghost dance shirts. And these shirts were to be decorated and prayed in and worn often, and that they would be created, that they would be strong enough to repel the white man's bullets. And so that these ghost dance shirts would protect them. That if the Native Americans rejected American culture, rejected American food and drink, went back to the ways of living a clean Native lifestyle, again, not living the way whites wanted them to live, if Wovoka could get these natives to practice the ghost dance, to make them practice these dances and these rituals, that the buffalo would come and that the whites would be buried beneath them and that Native America, the Sioux, would rise again. This, if you think about it, think of how desperate the Sioux were. Of course, a prophet preaching these things would make them feel like this could happen. And so the natives grew desperate to believe in almost anything they could. In 1890, the ghost dance happens, and most of these dances happen in South Dakota. Sitting Bull is rounded up by the United States government to basically so the government could say, you need to stop with these ghost dances. We want to disarm the natives. There's possibility of Sioux uprising on the reservations. And so the government was very fearful that the ghost dance would kill off all of the progress that the Americans had made in assimilating these natives. Sitting Bull was brought by 44 Sioux men to the government agency, but he never made it. A skirmish broke out in front of Sitting Bull's home, and a Sioux man pulled out a gun and shot Sitting Bull in the head, killing the great prophet of the Sioux. And Sitting Bull had a vision at one point saying that his death would be bestowed by the people, his own people would kill him. So Sitting Bull's final prophecy came correct. Sitting Bull was killed by his own people. The death of Sitting Bull and the death of Crazy Horse pretty much signified that all true armed resistance was now over. All the great leaders of the Sioux Nation were now gone, and that there was no great leadership by the Sioux. And they grew even more desperate. The Sioux grew more desperate to the point where at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota on December 29th, 1890, the United States government sent in 1,000 troops to Wounded Knee Creek, where there was a Native American settlement, and that they were to be forced back onto the reservation. A skirmish broke out between a deaf man and some natives and Americans, and a gun accidentally went off firing, and then the military unloaded weaponry and unloaded fire onto the men, women, and children at Wounded Knee. Some 150 Sioux men, women, and children were killed, most of them even shot in the back as they were running away from the military, and it was considered a great massacre of the Native American people. There was a mass burial site days after the slaughter of these 150 Sioux men, women, and children. And the massacre was photographed. The burial was photographed of the frozen bodies sitting on tops of the snow. And this massacre pretty much indicated that no more resistance at all, period, would happen in the West. By 1900, no Native American lived freely on the West. And what the Wounded Knee Massacre showed the people was that the government was willing to slaughter innocent men, women, and children. What the surrender of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, what the reservation life from 1865 to 1900, Native American culture and lifestyle was simply destroyed. And that no Native American after 1900 lived freely in the West. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you got a lot out of it, as a lot of this stuff you're going to see in class, maybe on a quiz. I don't know. Enjoy the day and be good.